All right, we're on. So, Gauri, thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Abhijit.
So, Gauri, you are a journalist, you're a geopolitical analyst, you have written numerous articles about various geopolitical issues, and you're the author of a very interesting book, Blinkers Off: How Will the World Counter China, which was first published in 2021. And lest I forget, you're also a noted artist in the field of Bharatnatyam. So, thank you for being here. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction.
So I brought you on to offer a fresh perspective on China, an Indian non-blinkered perspective on China. We have the Western Occidental perspective. We see it everywhere. We also have the tired Indian tactical perspective, narrow perspective on China. But you, I believe, have gone broader and you have examined issues from a historical and multi-layered perspective. So why don't you tell us about the book? FYI, I still haven't read it yet because I wanted to approach this conversation without any preconceived notions. So please tell us about the book. What is the book about? What made you write the book, and what do you discuss in the book?
Right. So the book, as you mentioned, Blinkers Off, takes a perspective around what really does the China challenge mean? What does it mean to have a country like China, which is looking to overpower in not just military aspects but non-military aspects of engagement as well with the world, whether it is trade, whether it's technology, whether it's even global governance and global bodies like the WTO, WHO, UN, and so on. So the book talks about what are the challenges that China presents, and when I say China, I mean, of course, the leadership, not the people of China. Of course, they're also victimized by what CCP's designs are. So, what are the challenges that CCP presents, and more importantly, is it important to then look at other ways of countering China? Nobody wants a war. Nobody wins in a war. And even China knows that. Chinese president also knows that. Nobody wins in a war. So how do you deal with a country like China, which is looking to incite warlike tendencies in other countries, whether you take India, whether you take the other Indo-Pacific countries, you take the Quad, but to look at non-military aspects of countering China, which, as I said, could be trade, technology, and several other aspects, information, cyber, that's such a real problem that the world faces, and a huge challenge that China presents. So the book essentially talks about this, and it also presents why we need to talk about China. So it essentially has five broad questions that it raises. One is, what was the rise of China all about? How did it rise? How is it that we talk about this miracle of growth in 25 years? China is this big economic engine. How did that happen? It breaks a few myths and very common myths that have been propounded as to how China embraced capitalism and so on. It breaks some of those myths as to what really happened. Now, the second question it talks about is that if China has risen, why does it impact every country on the earth? Then what are the ways in which it can be countered? And then lastly, it also asks a question and answers that, which are the countries that will counter China? And there it makes a case that America cannot counter China on its own. It may be big, but it's not big enough to counter China. The book makes it's a clear distinction between how America was much bigger during the Cold War. Soviet Union was much smaller in comparison in terms of economic might. So America cannot counter China on its own like it did in the Cold War. So it needs allies, it needs partners. And who will these be? It will, of course, be India. It will be countries like France, which has the second largest exclusive economic zone in the world after America. So it has a huge presence it has a huge maritime presence. So it will play a very important role. So those are really the 4 5 key questions that the book answers.
And what motivated you to write this book?
Right. So I went to China, and there I started with two questions, which was it was a global conference that I had gone to a couple of times to China. And there I saw that apart from me, I was representing India there in the Indian media, every other Asian country had choreographed answers and rehearsed answers to what Chinese were asking. And I was one of the only ones who refused to answer in that. When I say choreographed, because they were sitting at a certain distance, they were responding with hand gestures, all that was choreographed. I refused to abide by any of those. I said, I'm not going to come here and respond to what you want. Fair enough, we can figure out a structure in which we'll have the conversation. That's understood. But when I refused to stick to their guidelines and what they wanted, then I began by asking, why is it that every other media outlet that had come representing several other Asian countries were not willing to reply the way I was replying, which is that you cannot expect me to answer questions according to what you want. And that's when I started with the premise that how big is China in these countries? And those countries were Azerbaijan, Malaysia, South Korea, and several others. And that's how the story started unraveling. How big is China, and why none of these countries have a voice against China? And if it is important, who will raise that voice, and why it needs to be done right now? Of course, COVID ended up becoming another major inflection point, which showed the fault lines to the world and became a catalyst really for starting this conversation.
So why did it take until the emergence of COVID for the world to wake up? I mean, I can see that the perception has shifted a lot after COVID came on the scene. So why did it take until COVID for this to happen? I mean, the world could see what the Chinese were doing all this time. Why COVID, and why did the perception change after that?
The reason for that is a lot of people still believed in that very romantic version and vision of China. Here is this country which is looking for economic prosperity, and we're going to look at shared prosperity if we tie in together. And it's just about trade, it's just about common goals. The whole of Europe believed that. It's not just Asia. Why blame some of the poorer countries of Asia? Richer economic nations were also willing to join on the same economic trip. So all these myths were broken when the world was forced to look at China through a completely different prism. Italy, for example, it took the COVID pandemic for Italy to realize that even during the pandemic, when the Chinese president picked up the phone to speak to his Italian counterpart, he talked about the health silk route while he was offering masks and PPE kits. Shame on him for doing that,
Yes.
because you are trying to help a country in the grip of a pandemic, but there you are promoting your own vision on another new arm of the BRI. And those conversations became apparent to the world that what really China was after.
So could you talk about the rise of China? Because if you look at the history, the economic history of China, until let's say 1979, 1980, China was a dirt poor third world nation on par with India. And then something happened. What happened? I mean, did the US aid and abet the rise of China in some way? How did China manage to rise so quickly and so high?
Mm. In fact, the comparison with India was relevant even till 1990. Till
Yes.
1990, US, sorry, I beg your pardon, India and China, the GDP was 360 and $320 billion. It was only in 2000 that China became a 1 trillion plus economy, and we had a decade of missed opportunities, courtesy those half a dozen governments which came and went,
Yes.
and priorities were completely mixed up that time. But having said that, as far as what really worked for China, what really happened, of course, Deng Xiaoping played a very big role. That's part of the very popular narrative that, here is this man who opened six SEZs, and, things suddenly changed overnight. It obviously was not as simple as that. The fact is, there was the backstory, which was the 1971 war that had happened, the backstory of the India-Soviet key collaboration that had happened. And here there was Nixon trying to break that. He was looking for virgin markets after the post-war capex overspending that American companies had gone through. So they had gone through this huge cycle of capex spending. They needed new markets to absorb the extra capacity of the American companies, and they were looking for virgin markets. And India was as big as China. In fact, India at some level was considered to be better because there was more law and order, and all those things were there. Democracy, which of course Chinese did not offer. Intellectual property rights, individual property rights, all those things mattered, and they were there for India. But what didn't happen, or what didn't work out, was the fact the Soviet-Indo relation was something that Nixon was not in favor of, and Nixon wasn't comfortable with. And that's the reason why he wanted to open ties with China. A lot of it, people think, is because of geopolitics. Yes, but there were also geo-economic reasons. And because at that point of time, the Pakistanis had a very good relationship with America, that also weighed in. In fact, it was Yahya Khan who opened the link between Nixon and the Chinese. Chow En Lai took 6 months to reply to Yahya Khan, but it was Yahya Khan who was instrumental. So, because of that deep link that the Pakistanis and the Americans had, that Nixon felt that he wanted to reach out to China and he did not want India as an alternative market for American companies. Yes, the Chinese did open 6 SEZs. Yes, they did experiment with a lot of coastal development approach. But the fact is that coastal development approach only had about half a dozen odd districts of eastern China, the coastal belt. That's it. There were six. There were 4 SEZs, in fact, which were later added on to 2 more. And then there were a couple of river ports, export oriented zones, but it was that small little belt on coastal China where this prosperity was coming in. So America played a very important role on multiple occasions. One, of course, in starting this journey for them, and second, later on, in becoming instrumental in getting China into WTO. Since China entered WTO, it has grown about 11 times in size. It was Bill Clinton who got China into WTO. He was, of course, hoping that they will embrace democracy and they will embrace liberalism and so on and so forth. You can keep spinning those yards, and you can keep having those romantic notions of how Chinese will change. They didn't change, but what they did ensure was that they changed the system, they gamed the system, and they ensured that WTO worked to their advantage, and they grew 11 times and continue to grow at the expense of some of the labor intensive industries of America, India, and even Japan.
So is this an example of strategic naivete on the part of the US, that they could not see what the Chinese were up to? The Chinese were never going to become democratic and liberal and all that. The CCP, it's not in their DNA. Could the Americans not see that over all these years and decades?
Again, I wonder why they did not, because there was intel inputs that they continued to get all along. Even during these last 20 years, most American companies have complained about IPR losses. They've complained that they have been forced to let go of tech and ensure technology transfer, which they don't wish to if they want to enter into the Chinese market. So it's not like none of this was not clear to the Americans as to how they were aiding and abetting the China's rise. But the fact is, American democracy, for all its virtues and its wonderful system it is run, or it is handicapped by capitalist interests. And that, unfortunately, is the reality that Americans need to now understand and solve, that it is the capitalists who run their country and their interests are paramount, and the national interest at some level is subservient to the capitalist interest, and it continues to be so even after COVID. Even now you have messrs Apple and company telling that we don't want to exit China. Too bad that you're asking us to do so. Those capitalist interests have always worked and will continue to do so unless Americans figure out and these fault lines in their democratic system.
That's a very important observation. Now, how did China manage to rise so significantly? I mean, it rose, like you say, 11 times. Was it all on the back of manufacturing and industries?
It was largely on the back of manufacturing. It was largely on the back of so there were some key issues that WTO required and does require countries to adhere to when they are administered into the WTO system. For China, some of these were exchange rate, which is still not there. You need to have a free exchange rate to ensure that trade can happen freely. That isn't there. Second, other important is intellectual property rights. That isn't there. There is no IPR protection whatsoever for companies operating in China. The third and a very important aspect of countries wanting to enter the WTO regime is to abide by the subsidy mechanism that WTO has, which is that you've got to unwind your subsidies unless it's in some very key areas like agriculture and stuff, where even India says that we need to protect our farmers. But outside of that, outside of those key areas, the subsidy mechanism needs to be unwinded. China has never unwound its subsidy mechanism, and that's the reason why its exports, its manufacturers are so much cheaper than anywhere in the world. There was a study which said, which the book also mentions, that on average, Chinese exporters get a rebate of 17%. Which country on earth and which exporter on earth can compete with that? Nobody. Absolutely nobody can compete with that. 17% rebate means you wipe out all local manufacturers in any country. And that's exactly what has happened. America has lost about 5.5 million manufacturing jobs. Some of the most labor intensive towns are now ghost towns because there's absolutely no way that American capitalism can respond to this kind of subsidy mechanism. It's the same for Japan, some of the most in labor intensive Japanese markets. Likewise for India. Even we need to figure out and have answers to those questions, that how long will we take to respond to such grievous and such egregious errors as far as China's handling of the WTO mechanism is concerned. And lastly, equally important is that WTO says that either you're a developed country or you're a developing country. If you come on board as a developing country, we're going to allow you some leeway till you become more prosperous. But the fault line is, because it's a very consensus driven organization, China continues to be a developing country as compared to a UK or a Germany or a Japan. So China may be at about 9 times of UK's economy. I'm just taking 2 trillion versus 18 trillion, just for ease of calculation. And it is a developing country, and UK is not. So stringent measures will be applicable to some of these countries like a UK or a Germany and others, but the leeway will be given to China, which will be in the same league as a Venezuela or a Uganda. Is that fair?
And then we also have all this rampant IP theft, intellectual property theft. I mean, the Chinese have had this very sophisticated and large scale hacking program. They stole so many American military secrets. There was this program they called Titan Rain in the early 2000s. They stole the blueprints for various fighter aircraft and whatnot. And the Americans never responded to that in sufficient force. So it appears to me that the Americans put money over national interest, like you just said. And the Chinese have also infiltrated the various global institutions like the UN, the WHO. They are now framing the rules that underpin the international order. And they also wish to make the Chinese currency reserve currency. So, what are Chinese ambitions like? What do they wish to be? Where do they wish to be by 2050? Do they seek to displace and replace the US as the sole superpower? Is that their ambition?
It is clear that they want to displace American system in all aspects, whether it is currency, whether it is their presence in some of these other aspects of global engagement, whether it is UN or any of the other bodies, or even engagement with countries in each of these continents. You take Europe, you take Africa, you take America, you take Latin America, which is America's backyard. There they are now an extremely important part in terms of their engagement with the entire Latin American continent. So Chinese ambitions are very clear. They want to be the de facto system, OS. As you say, they want to change the OS of the world. The de facto OS of the world right now is American. They want to change it to Chinese, whether it is in trade, economic, or other non-economic other aspects. So there's technology or realignment of global economies and countries. So there are a lot of countries which may not be ideally in the American orbit, but they are fence sitters. China's plan is to make them into the Chinese orbit. And they've been successful to a large extent on the back of their economic power to buy loyalties. I will not use the word alliances, they don't have any allies, but they've bought loyalties. And when loyalties are up for sale, there is a serious question mark as to how really can this be countered. And that's what America needs to figure out and answer. Unfortunately, it cannot do so on its own. It doesn't have answers for something like that.
It's very interesting that the it is the West that created all these fragmented nations in Africa. They drew these arbitrary lines on the map, and you have the civil wars, you have these dictators, and it is these dictators and these despots who are so easy to purchase if you know the art of bribery, and that's what the Chinese excel at, and that's why how Africa, Latin America, it's all in on the Chinese side. So do you see over the next decade or so the emergence of a multipolar world or a bipolar world?
It's as bipolar as it can be, and China is trying to make that even more because it is forcing nations to make a choice. It is forcing countries to choose that because I am going to give you money or I have already given you money, you need to now choose your loyalties. And should you decide to go away from us, should you decide to disengage, there will be consequences. And that's exactly what it's trying to tell countries in our immediate neighborhood, like a Nepal, like a Sri Lanka. It's trying to push that image and that propaganda very clear and that message very strongly to some of the countries, even in our neighborhood, that you need to now choose and come towards us. It doesn't help America's cause when you have a messy Afghan withdrawal. It doesn't help America's cause when you have a hopeless negotiation that is taking place right now in Ukraine because Russia won't back down and you frankly have no answers. America has no answers whatsoever as to how it will deal with Russia. All this furthers China's argument that, hey, you got to choose wisely. We are the future. We can offer you money. We can offer you everything that America is not able to. And America, by being America's friend, you're not gaining anything. You come to our side. So the bipolarity of the world is what China is trying to create, and it is going to win in such a possibility simply because it is forcing countries to choose. By winning, I mean making countries choose. I'm not saying that China is going to overpower or become more influential, but what I'm trying to say is it's going to become instrumental in forcing countries to choose a bipolar approach. Of course, nations like India are the ones who will be the pivot in ensuring it is not bipolar because India stands between an America and a China. And frankly, the only regional counterweight to China in Asia is India. And I think it's going to be very important that New Delhi realizes the responsibility it needs to shoulder from here on.
So let's take a nation like Sri Lanka. They are in the Chinese debt trap and they have kind of defaulted on some payments. So what are the consequences for Sri Lanka if it doesn't repay the Chinese? I mean, can the Chinese just force Sri Lanka to give away parcels of land? What if the Sri Lankans refuse to give those that land, that port, or whatever? What happens? What are the consequences?
Right. So China's entire muscle power is on the back of its BRI. So the book also talks about BRI, and I did some study in that. I'm going to give two, three facts that explain how it has exploited some of the smaller countries and their need for funds. So BRI is essentially project finance. Project finance, by its very nature, should be long term. It cannot be short term because these projects have gestation period of 30 years, 40 years, and so on, and they can't make money sooner than that. BRI projects have a 10-year period after which the return has to start, repayments have to start. No project can start paying after 10 years, which means repayments are going to lead to fresh debt. Countries will need to take more debt just to pay what they've already taken. That's point number one. So, debt spiral begins like that. Point number two is interest rates on long-term project finance is sub 0.5%. It's 0.3, 0.2% because that itself on a 30-year horizon becomes quite significant. BRI projects on average have 6.2% as the interest. It is shocking that countries are signing on the dotted line by 6.2% interest rate. This is on average. So obviously there are some projects which are even more than that. Now imagine repayments have started. Countries need more debt to service the 6.2 interest rate debt that they've taken earlier, and they continue to fall into the debt spiral. The third and the equally important point about BRI is that around the world, most major economic nations have formed a Paris Club, Paris Treaty that they've signed, by which if there are smaller nations which take these multilateral loans are not able to repay, then they should be bailed out. They should be bailed out by giving some concessional loans or something to ensure that the nation stands back on its feet so that no country should be forced to let go of sovereign assets. China is not a part of this club. It's not a part of the Paris Club, which means it can turn around and say, I am under no obligation to provide any lifeline to the country which has taken the loan. It is none of my business. It's signed on the dotted line. If it cannot repay, it's got to cough up the assets. So, any country like Sri Lanka will have to cough up assets because they've signed on a BRI project which allows absolutely no leeway whatsoever. What has worked for China for so long? Why these BRI projects have been signed so far? Local politicians. Unfortunately, greed is a universal sentiment. It has nothing to do with color, caste, religion, creed whatsoever. And China has been able to exploit that.
Right. So they are constructing a maritime Silk Road as well, which kind of coincides with the so-called string of pearls strategy, and Sri Lanka is part of that. So can't India offer to bail Sri Lanka out in some way in order to lessen the Chinese influence there?
So India is bailing out Sri Lanka in some parts. It has offered several loans, several concessions. But the problem is that Mr. Rajapaksa traditionally has been very close to the Chinese. And that is something at some level, I would say it is a failure of Indian diplomacy also that it has not been able to wean away Rajapaksa and his cabinet from the Chinese influence. See, they took the loans, they were close, is in the past. It was 2014, 2015. But since then, if right now India is helping them with loans, it is helping them with repayment, then it should be able to extract some sort of a, not a, no, if not a bargain, at least an assurance, at least a commitment. After all, Sri Lanka has nothing whatsoever in common with the Chinese, and they have everything in common with India. India is their elder brother, and it is saving them right now. So, Indian diplomacy needs to work on this right now. Diplomacy is not 2 plus 2 is 4. It is not 2 plus 2 is 22. It's none of that. It is the art of being able to negotiate with your back to the wall. And that is what India needs to work on right now.
So let me just go off on a short tangent. India's diplomatic corps is about 1,700 strong. I think it is smaller than the diplomatic corps of Singapore. What is India up to? I mean, it's been 7, 8 years since the Modi government came in place. Nothing has been done to reform the diplomatic corps of India. Why doesn't India induct more diplomats, maybe some lateral entry of various specialists, etc., and engage with various countries appropriately? And why can't India, in case Mr. Rajapaksa is being intransigent, why can't India put somebody else in place? Why can't India buy loyalties the way the Chinese do? What prevents India from doing these things?
Exactly. So his predecessor, Ranil Wickremesinghe, is close to India, and you're right that at some level, if we have our ecosystems in place in these smaller countries, we need to strengthen them. It's Sri Lanka is one example. Likewise, you have the Maldives, you have Seychelles. All these countries, we have our ecosystem. We need to strengthen them, especially now because they've been weakened by excessive Chinese influence, Chinese funds. And let me tell you, the local population in all these recipient countries resist Chinese. They hate the Chinese simply because when we go out, or when India or any other multilateral country goes, we try and engage with the local population. We try and create employment for the local population, and we create prosperity for the local population. Unfortunately, China has none of that on its plan. So what Pakistan is going through right now, some of the other recipient nations of BRI are going to reach there in a couple of years from now, which is you have Chinese employees, Chinese contractors, Chinese banks, Chinese gains. And that has started hurting the local population very significantly. India offers the advantage by saying that, we are in it together, we want your prosperity, and hence we rise. And that message needs to now be strengthened and needs to now become far more amplified. And you're right about the fact that as far as Indian diplomacy is concerned, it's shocking that no effort has been made whatsoever to reimagine it. Diplomacy is not just about, and pardon my saying it, we've well past the wine and cheese events. We need to get past that syndrome of wine and cheese events. The world has moved on. We need to move on as well. It's a fact that a lot of young students who are taking the UPSC exam do not want to become diplomats. I was at one of the sessions a couple of months back in a training session when I spoke to some of the young diplomats who were soon to be given their countries. They were not very enamored. They talked about how some of their friends in the academy were not enamored by becoming a diplomat. And that's a crisis that the government needs to resolve either by inducting lateral entry or by reaching out. Why is it that UPSC aspirants are not keen on having a foreign services career? We need to have those answers, because having a depleted foreign services force doesn't help us at all. It weakens our case, and it also impacts our ability to punch above the weight.
Indeed, yes. India needs to, in my opinion, have at least 10,000 diplomats so that we can engage effectively with various parts of the world. Now, you mentioned Pakistan, what's happening there. Pakistan is essentially becoming more or less a Chinese colony right now. It should be a salutary example for everybody else. Now, let's talk about Afghanistan and also Iran. So why do you think the Americans withdrew from Afghanistan and left this big power vacuum there? Is it like they've just given up? They're not able to uh, maintain an influence in Central Asia, or do you think it's some kind of long-term trap for the Chinese?
No, no, it's not a trap for the Chinese. In fact, on the contrary, I feel that Mr. Biden was ill-informed that if he continued to focus on the Middle East, then it will deprive his administration of the ability to focus more on China, as if the world is either or. It's not either or, and the Biden administration should not have thought of it either that way as well. The sense I got was that they wanted to withdraw from the Middle East only because they wanted to focus more on the Indo-Pacific. They wanted to focus more on the Quad, the Taiwan Strait, and Asia as a region. But in a world that we are living, which is so interconnected, and more so when you have greater alignment between some of the countries that China calls as its friends or allies, then America should have thought twice before taking such a drastic measure. It's very easy to withdraw, but the images of that withdrawal are going to haunt successive American administrations whenever they wish to reach out to any country to make an alliance, to make a friend, to make a partner. They'll not be able to succeed. As far as China is concerned, it's apart from the from again a calculation which many feel that because America has exited, China will be able to enter, provide loans, and things are going to be easy. That rule book, that playbook by which China works, which is those bottomless wallets that work for it to buy loyalties, unfortunately do not work in Afghanistan. The reason is because the region is in such a mess that it doesn't help China's cause. Secondly, because of the separatist tendencies that Afghanistan is fanning in the East Turkmenistan region, China fears that if it starts funding more, then this money could be routed and reach the separatists and would end up hurting it more because of the whole Xinjiang movement, how it's clamped down its population there. It could hurt it more. And third, and most importantly, it has felt that even it needs to concentrate more on the Indo-Pacific right now. If America is looking to focus more on Indo-Pacific, then China cannot afford to take its foot off the pedal. So it's a case of not just America withdrawing, even China looking to focus more on the Indo-Pacific. My sense is, especially post the COVID and how the backlash has been around the world against China, Xi Jinping is going to focus more and more on Indo-Pacific, on Asia, and ensure that that is a region where America is not able to gain even an inch of foothold in terms of equity, strategic equity, than what it had earlier.
Now, the Indo Pacific certainly is one of the major focus areas for China. But the other one is Iran, because in the post COVID world, we have seen this development. There's this $400 billion deal, trade and military partnership that they have signed with the Iranians. So, what do you think is brewing there?
Hmm. So my feeling is that China is trying to create a parallel nexus on land as well. It has the maritime alliance very much in place. It has the Indo-Pacific where it covers all maritime important strategic maritime routes. it is wanting to do a similar thing for land as well. So you have Iran, you have Pakistan, you have Russia, you have Turkey. All these are countries where they are, of course, what ties them together, and Russia, of course, what ties them together is an anti American syndrome, the desire and the feeling to upend the present world order. And for that, they will going to stick together with China, and there a parallel axis could be created. And I think that is where Iran would be most important, because both Iran as well as Russia have deep links in the Middle East, and that will be very relevant and important for China to be able to create some kind of a parallel nexus against America in days to come. In Middle East, it has also invested very heavily in Saudi Arabia as well as UAE. It is now one of the largest investors in both these countries, which are American allies. But Saudi Arabia is an American ally, but it is now Chinese investments which really dictate the terms there. So my sense is, going forward, it is looking to create some kind of a parallel nexus against America in the Middle East, which it can use uh, to not just change the balance of power, but also get access to resources. I think there it's primarily a resource-driven agenda that China is after.
And what do you make of the cooperation and coordination between China and Russia? They are engaging in the systemic coordination and cooperation. What we are seeing in Ukraine and Taiwan, it's like a pincer movement. So we know that these two countries have had a very fraught past. They almost went to war in the 1960s, the Usuri River incident. Russia nearly nuked China. So what do you make of this? I would not call it an alliance, but there is a coordination going on. How long do you see that lasting?
It's a marriage of convenience. It's a fact that it suits both Mr. Putin as well as Mr. Xi Jinping that they see Mr. Biden's whatever policies turned down, and American administration policies completely failing. So it suits their agenda. So they're going to continue to collaborate till the time their common minimum program is achieved. But that, I don't think, is going to last for a very long time, because these are both men with very large and giant egos. I refuse to believe that Mr. Putin is at any point of time going to concede that Russia is not as big as China. And he's never going to concede that. And Xi Jinping is never going to concede that even if I'm a bigger economic power, my military strength is nothing when it comes to comparing to Russia. He's not going to concede that either. So when it becomes a matter of prestige and individual pride and ego, that's when these leaders will start clashing. But till then, this collaboration will continue, and it's going to play out very significantly in Africa as well. We've seen those trials, those military drills that happened with South Africa, military drills with Iran. So this region is going to see a lot more action, and that's the reason why China is also backing Russia on Ukraine, because it's the same playbook that they both wish to play with. They are both authoritarian leaders. They hate anything which has anything to do with liberalism, democracy, individual rights, liberty. None of that they agree with, and they want to back each other on all these fronts where their playbook is being ratified.
Now let's talk about the Indo-Pacific. The Chinese in the past, since the mid 90s, they have transformed themselves completely into a maritime nation. They've always been a land power, but this is the first time they've transformed themselves into a maritime nation. They are churning out warships and submarines like sausages. How much of a threat is it for India in the long run in the Indian Ocean region?
Very. Because of all our military strengths, Abhijit, I'm disappointed that our Navy still does not get the kind of attention, importance, and priority that it should. Yes, we are obsessed with our army, which it should be. It's not like I'm not undermining any of that, because we have our land threats with Pakistan and China. But my sense is that the real threats is going to be the naval threat, and there we have no real strengths. We need to really boost our capabilities there. More so because when you are dealing with China, you are dealing with the whole of the Indo-Pacific. When look at how it has taken strategic positions in the Indian Ocean, whether it is Seychelles, Maldives, Mauritius, South Africa, the whole of Eastern Africa. all of that is on the back of naval strength. All of that is not on the back of tanks and armored vehicles. So we need to get our priorities correct there. Even 10 years later, if we wish to be a force to reckon with, we need to have a naval capability that does justice to our ability to counter China. If we wish to counter China, our naval capability needs to be of the same order. Yes, we cannot churn out warships the way China is. It has produced more frigates, corvettes than the whole of the Asian region put together, I think, in the last couple of decades. So we can't compete with that. But where we can't compete in the size of the fleet, we can most certainly compete in terms of the ability of the fleet. Even there, a lot more needs to be done.
The strength of a navy doesn't depend on the number of ships you have. It depends on the number of missiles you can deploy on any given
Yes.
any given day. Now, let me drag you into a controversy because I'm evil. Do you think India needs more aircraft carriers or submarines? Because the Navy loves aircraft carriers, huge ships. Who doesn't want to be on one, right? What does India need? Submarines, aircraft carriers? What's your opinion?
Can I say that India needs less toilets, and therefore, when it's asked saving money, it will be able to get both of them. So yes, it's fact that we need to be more nimble-footed in our approach towards countering the future. Aircraft carriers, to a large extent, is a policy of the past. A lot of the past defense capabilities was centered around aircraft carriers. But the future is those nimble subs, which are not just hard to detect, impossible to detect. And China has invested very heavily in those. They have been very, very bullish on the subs, and there we need to have a very clear strategy on how to counter it. Because if we want Sri Lanka to be back in our orbit, if we want the Seychelles campaign to now stop, if we want our man Nasheed back in Maldives, we need to back this up with a strong naval force. We need to back this up with our having significant and strategic ports where our naval capability can be on display. So we need to really focus on those.
We love slogans. We call the Indian Ocean our strategic backyard. But you don't win the world based on slogans. You need to have assets in place. And that's what we're not seeing. I mean, I'm really disappointed, just the way you are, about the way our naval buildup is going. There's no buildup at all. Now, do you think it's possible for India and China to coexist in peace as two strong independent nations in the long term?
Yes, absolutely, provided China is able to see that. See, all countries can and will live peacefully and will coexist peacefully. It is countries like China which is forcing everybody on the brink. And that is where the world needs to wake up and realize that if we can bring China to be able to accept peaceful coexistence, then there is no problem. The problem lies in leaders like Xi Jinping who envisage that they are the new Red Emperor, that they want to go back to the same Middle Kingdom imagery, that there are only vassal states and there are tributaries, and I am bestowed this heaven's decree is what I have. Tianxia, that concept that Xi Jinping keeps talking about. So it is leaders like him who need to be told that peaceful coexistence is important, and every other country will be able to abide by it. India most certainly is a very peaceful country. It will, and I'm sure about that. At no point of time will it not look to peacefully coexist with China, provided Chinese leadership can see through that. If they don't, I believe it's not just going to be India, but the liberal world together. It's going to be the world versus China that we are going to see.
I personally see Mr. Xi Jinping as nothing but a symptom of the Chinese Communist Party's attitude. I mean, the transformation of China from a meek nation to a belligerent nation started under Mr. Hu Jintao. It's when
Yes.
those foreign ministry officials started gesticulating and all that. So that's when the transformation happened, and it's just going on under continuing under Mr. Xi Jinping. If Mr. Xi Jinping is replaced with somebody else, I suspect the same attitude will be visible. So, do you think it's the Chinese Communist Party's attitude that is the problem? I think they only respect strength, and if India doesn't develop its strength, then it's going to, I don't know, not last long.
Yes, the challenges that India faces are not They're of course not insurmountable, but at the same time, they're not very small either. They are significant. We need to be very clear that our ability to act as a counterweight needs to be matched by our willingness to reach there. And for that, we need to have military might, we need to have economic might, and we need to have a larger geopolitical might. A very small example I'll take, which is and, this is a complete detour of the conversation we're having. The Canada truckers thing that happened, the Western media is all supporting Justin Trudeau's decision. But the same media could not be convinced by our government as to why the laws were not good. Fine, the media is biased, it is viewing us through a prism, but it also shows our inability to put our message across. And that's also a part of being able to have a larger clout. If we have clout, we will be able to get our message across. And that's what the book's premise also. My book's premise is also just that don't just count tanks and frigates. It's about larger clout, which is in all these domains. So India needs to do justice in all these aspects. We are a tech superpower, but are we a tech superpower in terms of military technology? Are we a tech superpower in terms of ensuring that no cyber attack can take place on our soil? Those are aspects of technology superpower that are going to be very relevant going forward. And that is where, unfortunately, I believe not enough work is being done.
I agree. I mean, the 20th century approach is that there are three domains of warfare: air, land, and sea. But today you have space, you have cyber, you have information, you have lawfare, you have so many things. The Chinese have
Yes.
evolved these concepts. It looks like our bureaucrats and officials are still mired in a 20th century mindset. Now, you spoke about the media. The Chinese media, even the Western media, acts like a propaganda arm of their interests, of the Chinese interests, of the Western interests. The BBC is the propaganda division of the UK. You have the Guardian, you have the Global Times for China. For America, you have NYT, Washington Post, you have RT for Russia, Al Jazeera,
Yeah.
and so on. And many of them use Indian writers and journalists to shape Indian opinions. And
Yeah.
false narratives are crafted. Young Indians are indoctrinated into seeing India through a foreign alien perspective. This is neo-colonization in a way. What is India doing to counter this? Where is India's BBC, CNN, Global Times? Why doesn't India have a globally visible and globally relevant news agency? We have the money, but why don't we do it?
We don't have the willingness. And also, see, we have a public broadcaster. We have a public broadcaster with a clear mandate. But is that mandate being fulfilled? That's the point, And the second important part is that when we talk about soft power, we don't realize the hard punch of the soft power. That it was just about a fortnight back that we had the British MP with clear links to the Chinese, which came out in public, and it unraveled just how much China owns in terms of thought leaders, academicians, think tanks, media, politicians, political outfits, universities. As I said, this is the hard punch of the soft power. All this for us, unfortunately, soft power is and I hate to be critical, but for us, soft power is food, yoga, and Bollywood music. But it's not
True.
that. Soft power is a lot more. It is our ability to enter into the minds of thought leaders and shape narratives. We cannot accept an India out campaign in one of the Indian Ocean region littorals to succeed for months. It tells something that we are not even being able to talk about and shape narratives in small Indo-Pacific countries. Forget about Western Europe. Forget about large countries in any other part of the world. Shaping narratives is something that we need to take very seriously. And if our public broadcaster is not being able to do that successfully, then alternate avenues need to be created. Yes, we do not have a BBC. Yes, we do not have a CNN. We do not have an Al Jazeera. But what we have, we can most certainly do better than what we do.
We have a public broadcaster that is still, it acts as if it's still the 20th century. Doordarshan and Prasar Bharati and all that, they are still mired in the 20th century mindset. And you have lots of foreign funding in the Indian media also. Like you mentioned, the British MP was exposed. If they're able to do that in the UK, in the US, in Canada, in Western countries, they are certainly doing it in India as well. And one could argue that you can see that certain Indian media organizations have become de facto appendages of foreign interests. So, what can be done to counter that? Because people are losing trust in the media.
Australia is a classic example of just how
Yeah.
much China ended up owning Australian thought. So much that Australia had to pass a law in 2016 which said that anybody who has anything to do with public policy needs to come out and file in the register, tell who are they lobbying for, what is the ultimate aim that they are lobbying for, and who are their masters. I mean, the Australian thought was completely hijacked by China. So we need to be very clear that we are reaching, we may not have reached the Australian levels, but we are reaching in terms of the deep links that China has been able to make in India and across the board. Politicians, why blame the politicians? There's media, there's think tanks, there is universities, there are students. We need to be very clear that they all are following the diktat of some of their masters. I am not saying that they are all following the Chinese masters. They may not have Chinese masters, but they have benefactors, and those benefactors need to be brought out in the public domain. That's the reason I gave the Australian example, that those benefactors need to be told in the public that if someone is lobbying for this kind of a thought or this kind of a narrative or this kind of a change in public policy, then who is the ultimate beneficiary? We live in times of social media, Abhijit. The power of social media is huge. If some of these changes are brought out, believe me, and I'm very positive that in a couple of months itself, a lot of these well entrenched positions will start changing. What traditional media is not able to do, social media will be able to do. I think it's just a matter of bringing out some of those important policy changes, and then I believe those changes will automatically come in.
So, how do you see? How do you think journalism has changed after social media entered into the picture? Today, you can do micro journalism. A single person can tweet something, put out some news, and it can spread everywhere. So, how do you think social media has impacted journalism in today's world?
Very significantly, now social media is forcing journalists to do journalism and get out of their cozy comfort zone. So, to that extent, journalists are being forced to get out of their comfort zone, respond to the needs. But I believe media is going through a churn, Abhijit. This
Mhm.
churn that we are going through right now is a result of the ability of some of the entrenched positions in media to still create and shape narratives, and the ability of social media to seek change. Social media is not able to make change on its own, but it creates a clamor for change, whatever it may be, good, bad, ugly, whatever it may be. Social media starts that dialogue. And I think traditional media right now is in that state of flux to find its feet. Where does it want to be? In which phase? And I think the next 2, 3, 4 years are really going to define Indian media going forward.
There used to be this term called gonzo journalism. Sure, what is it? Run and gun journalism. It's something to do with filmmaking also. There's a certain aesthetic, certain style of filmmaking, and gonzo journalism is kind of part of that. So, is that possibly going to be the future of journalism? How do you see journalism evolving in the next decade or so? Everything. Do you think the entrenched interests will remain, or do you think the system will change?
They will have to respond to social media. The tsunami of social media stories that now engulf us, and social media content that we are now all well fed on, is something that traditional media has not responded to so far. Look at the viral videos, some of those important nuances that we get to know through social media. The established media still doesn't respond to those, and I believe they will now be forced to respond to those. Even if you see, for instance, there are these state elections that are happening right now, and there is wall to wall coverage in all media channels about those, but still the social media coverage is different. the social media channels or YouTube channels to cover any of these elections in a completely different light. And that ground up approach is what I feel is going to really now become the hallmark of Indian media going forward. They have to come back to listen to what the viewers are saying instead of being in their echo chambers. That change is going to happen on one end. And on the second end, I believe this churn is also going to lead to some introspection when it comes to serious journalism. It may not be in TV, it could be in print. Electronic media, by virtue of its nature, unfortunately, it cannot be faulted for being, not so intense in terms of provoking deep thought. That is something that print media can do, and I believe that is also going to happen as this churn ends, because even print media otherwise has lost its relevance. Why would you read the
Yes.
newspaper if you've got everything on the go on your mobile? You will read it only for provoking you to think differently, and that I think newspapers will be forced to do.
And what we are doing right now, having this conversation, is this also a form of journalism?
I would assume so. It's definitely in that domain. It is forcing. I hope it forces the viewers to think out of the box, take off their
Yes.
blinkers, and understand and analyze what the world around us is right now and how it's being shaped.
Right. So could you now, before we end, could you summarize what is the message of your book in a nutshell? What are the recommendations that you have given for India from the Indian perspective?
So, two, three very important recommendations that the book comes out with is one is punch above your weight, which is that when you are talking about building an ecosystem as far as your geopolitical might is concerned, don't only think in your immediate neighborhood. Think regional, think global. Why is it that an Indian should not be heading a WHO? Why is it that an Indian should not be heading the WTO or the ITU? Why is it that an Indian should not make a pitch for the UN General Assembly head? We should make that pitch. It is commensurate and in tandem with our overall uh, regional heavyweight status. So that's one thing that the book talks about. Second thing it says is don't get obsessed with dealing with China only on the Ladakh border or by putting submarines in the Bay of Bengal. That's not the way to handle China. Handle China through trade. That is its weakest point. Handle China by developing your own manufacturing strength. Handle China by speaking to it from a position of strength. Only countries that have a deficit against China can bring the Chinese on the negotiating table. America can bring China on the negotiating table because it ran a huge deficit against China. And that is something that even India does. Yes, we have a huge story that goes, we've lost $1 trillion in the number of deficits that we've been running against China. It's not as if that if we had not bought it from China, we would have done it on our own. We would have bought it from some other country. So that deficit would have stayed. But use that deficit as a leverage to bring the Chinese on the table, because they stand to lose 75, $80 billion every year from Indian trade. Yes, it is a smaller percentage of their overall trade, but nevertheless, it's important. So use your trade leverage against China is another important message that the book talks about. And third, it says develop areas of expertise in the new age of warfare. The new areas of warfare is technology, information. When we talked about the Canadian truckers, it's information warfare. It's the ability to shape a narrative that can have disproportionate impact with no costs. There are no costs whatsoever involved in running an information warfare against a country. You shape a narrative with absolutely minimal impact. That's something that India needs to wake up to, the information warfare. And then also, of course, technology being the pivot that India needs to now focus on in terms of how it will focus on its new age warfare through technology superpower status that it has. So these are some of the core recommendations that the book makes.
Okay, Gauri, thank you very much for your time. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abhijit. Thank you so much for having me.